Have you ever wondered why sometimes you have no control? Like something else takes over the wheel and you're left to your wits. So life can be difficult and unruly. The feelings evoked are enough to handle on their own, no less having to deal with other factors and variables that come along the way. Mental anguish encompasses suffering, and desires cause mental anguish through expectations being set and not met. The only way to dissolve the need to desire is through meditation, empathy, patience, and time. So philosophy and understanding why we are here and willing to exercise a purpose has always piqued my interest. As another human being, I want to share what I value and my perspective on fundamentals that people most often overlook. So during this presentation, I will explore the following: desires, what they are and what they entail. Okay? Suffering, the type of suffering and its link to desires, and some possible ways to counteract that link from suffering and desires. So, what are desires and what do they carry with them? Where I'm going to start here is what aren't desires, because there's a lot of different things that are desires. So, I'm going to start with food, water, shelter. These are needs, necessities. None of them are something that you want. You need them to survive. Desires are more items, ideas, possibly conclusions or futures. All these things are wanted. So we have two different types of desires. We got directional desires, desires that give one purpose, a need for a better life, possibly wanting to escape oppression or improvement, or escape from an impoverished third world country, or even the desire for a new car. This could be a directional desire. And then there are unnecessary desires, and these desires are a bit more complicated. So unnecessary desires are best defined as desires that cause strong attachment to an individual. So these unnecessary desires are a bit like a gradient. You can't really point them out very well, but they're there. And a few examples could be video games, friends, drugs, phones, TVs, and movies. So the strong attachment occurs because of the cycle of desire. When you get comfortable with a certain action or item fulfilling your desire, you start to rely on this action or item. Attachment to movies isn't being a movie junkie. But when you watch these movies, let's say because you're bored, rather than watching the movie because you genuinely want to watch the movie, then an attachment can occur, all right? Let's say you break up with your significant other and you start drinking to forget them. You start to get attached to the alcohol because it helps you forget about your ex. Or let's say you drink every night because you're lonely. And then when you get with another person, let's say you start a relationship, you always want to be with them. You're attached to being around them. All right? So these attachments are more, I'm just going to skip that part. And so anyway, are attachments all bad? No, they're practically how most of us function. You can be attached to books and learn about topics that interest you. You can get attached to school and get a great scholarship. But what needs to be distinguished is that these same type of attachments that can cause good things can also cause bad things and completely switch your life around. So where does... never mind. Now that we know what desires are and the concept of attachment, let's now move on to the opportunities that attachment creates and how suffering ensues from these opportunities. Okay, so what is suffering? and how do the desires really link up to it. The type of suffering that I'm talking about isn't the type of suffering that you get from not having your needs met. Once again, water, food, shelter, warmth, all these things, you kind of need those to live. And then also like escaping oppression, all this suffering, possibly in a third world country again. This isn't necessarily what I'm talking about. I'm talking about more intrinsic suffering. I'm talking about suffering from wanting something you don't have, from fearing something you might have that might be lost, believing you can't be happy without something, okay? This causes suffering. Stress and worry, anger and frustration, envy and jealousy is suffering. And the effects they have on your body is also suffering. Very important. Now, how attachment leads to suffering. Once the attachment has been developed from fulfilling the desires enough, whenever you want this item or action and cannot obtain it, it becomes suffering. You want a Pepsi, but can't have it. Suffering. You want a hug, but you can't have one. Suffering. You want love and companionship, but you can't have it. Suffering. Nevertheless, if things were to be potentially lost, okay, these things that you're attached to, suddenly they get revoked away. Like, let's say a parent takes away or threatens to take away your video games. Suffering. Boom. Let's say a boyfriend or girlfriend tries to break it off, or says that they're going to break it off. Suffering. All right, this concept of attachment is deeply rooted in philosophical texts and even religions such as Buddhism. Suffering is known as dukkha, and in Buddhism, it's known as dukkha in Buddhism, and is caused by tanha, which translates to craving, clinging, and thirsting. Buddhism teaches that dukkha and tanha are like yin and yang. One cannot live without the other. And I need to go. So, okay, now let's backpedal. We talked about desires and how they lead to attachment, and we talked about how attachment leads to suffering. Now let's move on to some different perspective that could balance this out. So if we go back to Buddhism, the way that dukkha and tanha are like yin and yang, but one cannot do without the other. But Buddhism tries to go past that and say that you can live without suffering, but it's just way farther down the road if you keep continuing on this trail of desires. But that's not what we're talking about here. I'm talking about how these small desires that you get caught up in can lead you astray from what truly matters in your life, whatever that is. Everything can be broken down and put into boxes of this is a desire, this is suffering, but it's only a way to like pinpoint at these things that just don't matter, like your need to get high every night. Let's say that you smoke weed and you need to get high every night. Not having that weed is causing suffering. It's taking energy away from you to be able to enjoy life, give to others, be there for people, to live the way that you want to live. You're constrained almost. You have this attachment, whatever it may be, to food, unhealthy food, not food just so you can survive, but good tasting food, to entertainment, to the need to not be alone. Like these types of desires, they're only going to take you away from fulfilling them healthily. It's only just a band-aid, you could say. And that is just a wound that's never going to stop healing unless you go at it from the source. That's where I'm trying to get at, but that's way deeper down and not exactly where I'm trying to go with this speech. Okay, to sum it all up, we aren't pushed and pulled in all sorts of directions in ways we can't describe. There is a relationship between desires and suffering, and understanding it could be the key in not getting turned around amidst true struggles and turmoils that are bound to arrive. All right, I hope some of you have reopened how you might view your sufferings and attachments. I'm sure this is a pretty out there idea in terms of how simple it sounds, because even in determining the difference between directional and unnecessary desires can be difficult. The most difficult is finding the line between a healthy and an unhealthy attachment, because it really lies in your intention. But that's the amount of suffering that's going to come to you, is how attached are you to this thing? What is, specific to your type of attachment? So at the end of the day, life is a balance. And what can be known also can become just as confusing, like it was never understood. I feel like this type of questioning on what is usually never thought about is of actual high importance, because it's the things we most often overlook that are the things that most often need to be checked. And that concludes the ending of my speech. That's 4 minutes over.